So let's cover a few logistical items first. This is our last in-class day for the semester. There will be new materials posted online for the rest of the semester, including either some videos or slides with voiceover and commentary. Perhaps I haven't decided exactly how I'm going to do that. I already have most of the materials prepared because at this point of the semester last year we were already all online, so I had presented that material that way. You have one more big assignment left for the semester. That is the factfulness workbook. So you should already be reading factfulness and be prepared to handle that. I may or may not post something for next week. I haven't decided yet. What we're going to do in class today is to give you all the basic framework that the rest of the textbook is going to use. So we're going to walk through the macroeconomic model, aggregate supply, aggregate demand model that the rest of the text is based on, and I'm going to try to connect it to all the other things that we've learned so far this semester, just to put it into context. You'll have to read the chapters and do it the same way as before. Watch the video, do the learning curve, read the chapter while you're doing the learning curve, then do the homework in order to fully understand these models. But I'm going to give them to you today so that you sort of see how they're drawn and how they work together. Let's look at this problem real quick. We have an explanation of what's happening in the market, connecting the quantity of money, the velocity of money, the overall price level, and the real output of things. So we learned that if we look at M times V, it equals P times Y. The quantity of money in the economy times the number of times that the money, every dollar bill changes hands, that is a good measure of total spending that is occurring in an economy in a given year. So if there's $4 trillion and they all change hands about 8 times, 7 or 8 times, then there's somewhere between 28 and $32 trillion that gets spent in the year. That's in nominal terms, that's dollar bills. It's not the real stuff, that's how much money gets changed hands. Now, Y is how much actual stuff gets exchanged, and P is the overall price level, so that total spending is equal to basically total production, or total that gets purchased, okay? So that everybody who comes to buy something finds something for sale, in a way. So then we have this idea that the two need to be balanced, and if we take these problems, we can start with the first one. If M is 150 and V is 5, that has to be equal to P times 50. 150 times 5 is 750 equals P times 50. Divide both sides by 50. We get P is equal to 15. So the overall price level in this example should be 15. Similarly, if I take 200 times 5, that's 1,000, divided by 50. 1,000 divided by 50 is 20. 100 times 5 is 500. 500 divided by 50 is 10. So what has happened here is that because the quantity of money has changed, but velocity has not changed, and real output has not changed, there's a direct relationship between quantity of money and the price level. As the quantity of money changes, it affects the price level. All right? That's what we learned last time. We saw Milton Friedman's license plate. It says that, and that's the basic idea. Now, when we take these principles and then look at growth rates, the math changes. So if we take, for example, the rate of change of prices. Suppose that last year the price level was 250, but then this year the price level is 300. What is the growth rate of the price level? We would take 300 minus 250, and divide it by 250. You guys did this a lot on the homework assignment, right? You did this kind of a rate of change kind of problem several times, and that would be 50 over 250, which is 20%. Now, if the price level is actually changing at 20%, that's a very high rate of inflation. That'd be pretty dangerous. Okay, so we're going to translate all of this into rates of change instead of absolute levels. So we will say that the rate of change of the quantity of money and the rate of change in velocity and the rate of change in the price level and the rate of change in output are all related, but instead of by multiplication, they're related by addition. They're related by addition when we look at the rate of change. And this, again, comes from the Euler equation, which you can look up. Now, what we're going to be interested in going forward with this semester is thinking about how things in the real economy are affected both by shocks and by situations that happen within the system. So what we'll do is we'll start with a model that has pi on the y-axis. Now pi is signifying the rate of inflation. So then this graph that we're going to draw is a rate of change graph. It's not an absolute levels graph. It's a rate of change graph. So the rate of change of the price level, that is inflation. And I want to use these variables in my model. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the rate of change of output and put that on my x-axis. All right, so this is, what I'm going to say though is that this is real GDP growth rate. That's what I'm putting on my x-axis. Notice M and V are not in the model. They're not directly inside of the model. Okay, which is to say that they are somewhat exogenous from the model. We're going to put them on here though in a minute. What I'd like to start by thinking about though is trying to understand how we can build a model that isn't about just one market, but instead is about all of the markets. Think about this, okay? So if we have a model for the market for shoes, this is what we did at the beginning of the semester. This kind of a problem where we have, it was a dark and stormy night that day. At the party, all was quiet. Everyone who came to sell something found someone to buy it. We have the market for shoes. Now, tell me, what would happen in the market for shoes if the price of milk goes down? So if the price of milk goes down, but the price of feed for cows doesn't go down, it could be that it becomes too expensive to feed the cows. So farmers who are raising dairy cattle might think, it's not worth it to raise as many cows. I will raise fewer cows. And what do they do about that in the meantime? They kill some cows. When you kill cows, what do you get? Meat and leather. Leather is an important input into the production of shoes. So, if the price of milk goes down, it could be that the supply of shoes increases. That is a very roundabout way of thinking, isn't it? How would I know if
the price of milk is connected to the market for shoes, really, we would do something called a cross-price elasticity, which maybe you remember from micro. Right, we're not going to go back over that today. But suppose this happens, right? The price of shoes will go down and the quantity of shoes will go up. Very good. Well, what about the market for all things? How is that affected? In Crusoe's world, he had to choose between two different things, coconuts and fishes. Let's suppose that Crusoe now is trying to choose between shoes and milkshakes. Right? And he has to choose between the two of them on his production possibility frontier. What has happened here is that he has chosen to have fewer milkshakes and more shoes. Am I making sense still? Okay, but one thing that's interesting to notice is that we're still on the same production possibilities frontier. It's the same frontier. In terms of our capacity to produce all goods and services, it hasn't changed. We're still able to produce somewhere along this line. Can this line get farther out? Sure. Sure, we can move farther out in our production possibility frontier. Usually that happens through changes in technology. So then we might think about how much can we produce overall? What is our overall level of production? And that might be a measure of the distance from the origin to the production possibility frontier. And as our economy grows, we can go farther out. Okay? So then this line is like a line representing all of the things. Within any particular market, right, the price might be going up or down, the total quantity might be going left and right, but in terms of our overall level of production within an economy, that is primarily affected by the amount of capital we have and the technology we have. Remember we did this in our solo model, where we had capital and output, right? And we had the relationship between capital and output. More capital, more output, right? Of course, over time, the economy is growing not just by buying more capital, but by buying more advanced capital, or by training employees who have higher levels of knowledge. The result of that is that in the future, our total level of productivity has also grown. It is increasing. This shift of the solo model is basically the same idea as this shift of the production possibility frontier. We're able to get more. How much more? How much more? Well, we've said that in general, or over the last 100 years or so, the United States has experienced about a 2 or 3% real GDP growth year over year. That's about the rate that our economy has been growing. We remember that for most of human history, time and then quality of life, for most of human history, we were basically getting by on $3 a day. And then in 1800, it sort of took off, didn't it? Okay, well, for this part of the graph, the growth has been about 2% or 3%. Is it always 2% or 3%? No, it's not constant. There's expansions and recessions over time, isn't there? Okay, so then we have this model of the way the world is going. Now, on this axis for my big market model, I've put real GDP growth rate. What's my real GDP growth rate? 2 or 3%. So then, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, how is my real GDP growth rate affected by changes in prices? How is my real GDP growth rate affected by inflation? What happens in the market for everything if inflation goes up? In the long run, nothing. In the long run, inflation and real output are not connected. Inflation is money, and we can change the quantity of money in the economy, and in the long run, it'll turn up as inflation, but it won't affect our real capacity to produce actual stuff. Our real capacity to produce stuff is constrained by what capital we have and what technology we have and understanding, not by money. Money can cause fluctuations in the short run, but in the long run, money is neutral. In the long run, money is neutral. So then, if the inflation rate is deflation, if it's negative 1%, what's my real GDP growth rate? 3%. If my inflation is 2%, what's my real GDP growth rate? Still 3%. If my inflation rate is 20%, what's my real GDP growth rate? Again, still 3%. This is my long run aggregate supply curve. Here I have a supply curve for one thing, for shoes. But it's related to the market for milkshakes. I have fewer milkshakes and more shoes now. But in terms of all stuff, once we aggregate it all together, it's the same. So then my long run aggregate supply curve is perfectly inelastic. It's straight up and down, right? Because it's representing my actual capacity to increase my productivity over time. Okay. So that's the first big piece of our new model. Notice, we walked through pretty much all the graphs we've done so far this semester to get there. Okay. Now, I've said that M plus V is total spending, total nominal spending. How many actual dollars are being spent every year? We're going to talk about total nominal spending. Now, who does this spending? Who does the buying in the world? Consumers, investors, government does the buying. Okay, then. So then total spending can be represented as a schedule of options. So we have a line like this. That's like a demand curve. It's our aggregate demand curve. And we're going to say that our aggregate demand curve is related to the rate of change in money plus the change in velocity. In other words, total nominal spending. So suppose this year you spend, in nominal terms, 7% more than you spent last year. In terms of the actual money flowing through your wallet, this year you spend 7% more than you did last year. Does that mean that you bought 7% more stuff? No. If everybody in the economy spent 7% more than they did last year, right, how much actual more stuff would they have bought? Well, there has to be stuff there for you to buy it. So my supply curve demonstrates how much stuff there is available to buy. And we've said that the amount of stuff available to buy has increased by 3%. So there's 3% more stuff being bought, but you spent 7% more dollars. What must that mean? It must mean that the prices of all the things that you bought went up by 3%. We take our change in spending and split it. 4%. Thanks. When I make a mistake, you got to tell me, okay? Otherwise, I know you're not paying attention. Ha ha ha. Right? We end up having to divide our spending between actual buying of more stuff and then the inflation rate of all prices. This line describes all of the possible points that would add up to 7%. If the economy were growing faster, for some reason. If we were growing at a rate of 5%, I would buy 5% more stuff. If I'm spending 7% more money, that must mean that inflation is going up by 2%. If the economy has shrunk and for some reason is producing 1% less this year than it did last year, then it must be the case what? If I'm spending 7% more than I did last year, it must be that inflation has gone up by 8%. Because 8 minus 1 is 7. 2 plus 5 is 7. This line is all of the things that sum up to 7. Are you with me? So our aggregate demand curve is describing total nominal spending that is divided between real production, buying of real stuff, and then the inflation rate. This is buying all the stuff that we buy, everything in aggregate. Now there's one more line on this graph. It's called the short run aggregate supply curve. There is no short run or long run aggregate demand curve, there just is the aggregate demand. The short run aggregate supply curve is related to producers' expectations about the inflation rate. What do producers think that inflation is going to be like? So at this point, producers are expecting 4% inflation. What happens if inflation is higher than that? They get fooled. They get fooled in the short run. In the long run, they discover they were wrong. But in the short run, they make mistakes. And this is part of the reason why recessions work the way that they do. It's because in the short run, employers and firms get fooled by changes in the inflation rate. They believe that the inflation rate is going to be 4%, and they make their expectations about how much to buy, about how much to produce, about how much to sell. All of the labor contracts that they write are all written with a certain expectation of what inflation is going to be. When inflation turns out to be something different, it takes them a while to figure that out. We're going to walk through that in a minute. Okay. If a producer in the short run makes a mistake, right, and inflation was higher than they expected, so they produced more than they would have otherwise, what has happened is that they have moved outside of their production possibility frontier. They produced more than what is sustainable to produce in the long run. Just like when you pull an all-nighter, like you did when you were doing your GDP map homework assignment, turning that in at the last, I'm just kidding, you guys did pretty well, right? The next day you need to take a nap, right? So then the producers are the ones who are making these errors based upon their expectations related to inflation. Okay. Now, it's important to realize that this green line here, the long run aggregate supply curve, that's home. That's where we want to get to. Why? Because at that point, all of our resources are fully employed. What that really means is you're fully employed, right? You and people that you love and people you hate have jobs. One thing about markets is that it takes the things that people that you hate produce and makes them still useful to you. Right? It helps to reconcile differences amongst individuals. So this is home. Our main goal is to try to stay at home, to remain in equilibrium at our long run level of output. If for some reason we find ourselves to the left of our long run level of output, we are in a recession. We're not doing as well as we could. We're not able to produce as much as we could, therefore we're not able to consume as much as we otherwise could, and we're made worse off. So the goal is always going to be to try to get back home again. Well, why would we not be at home? Why would we, for some reason, not be on our long run aggregate supply curve? There's lots of reasons. and we're going to work through those. Why would we be in a recession? This is one of the two big questions that macroeconomics is sort of trying to solve, is if there is a recession, what caused it? What caused the recession? And then the second question is, what should we do about it? Now, if I'm driving along and I realize that my car is making a really weird noise and going ka-thunk, ka-thunk, ka-thunk every time I turn left, right? What can I do about it? In the short run, I could try to only make right-hand turns. I'd have to go all the way around the block to get where I'm trying to go, but for the short run, I can do that as a response. But in the long run, I'm going to want to take my car to a shop to find out what's actually causing the problem, right? Well, if you're deep in a recession, which question is more important? What caused the recession or what to do about it? Oftentimes we prefer or we focus more on the what to do about it. We're not as concerned about understanding exactly what caused the recession as we are interested in figuring out what to do about it. Now, whatever prescription we give for getting out of a recession, it has to be that we have in our back of our minds some idea of what may have caused it. It might be a cloudy idea, but we have some idea. So, we have two big schools of thought. Suppose, for whatever reason, all right, the economy is not in equilibrium. Let's suppose that the economy is not in equilibrium because of a decrease in aggregate demand. People are not spending as much as they were expected to spend. So aggregate demand is lower than people were expecting it to be for whatever reasons. In particular, it's lower than what producers were expecting it to be. How could the economy correct itself so that we end up back at home? What has happened is that we are now, in the short run, over here. We are in a recession. Some people are unemployed. Some firms didn't sell as much as they expected to sell. And as a result, they had to lay some people off. And they're going to have to lower their prices because they thought that inflation was at this level. But it turns out that right now, inflation is actually at this level. So then these firms are going to realize inflation is lower than what we thought it was going to be. Once they realize that, they will update their expectations about what inflation is going to be. They will realize inflation is lower than I thought it was going to be. I'm going to have to change my prices. So the firm changes its prices. And now we are on a second short-run aggregate supply curve. However, are we back at home yet? Not yet. We are still in a recession. It's not as bad as it was. It's gotten better, but we're still in a bit of a recession because the firm's expectations about inflation were still overestimated. And it turns out inflation is lower than what they thought it was going to be, so they have to lower their prices. Right now, their best guess about what inflation would be is this number. So then they update their expectations. And the recession is not as bad, but we're not home yet, are we? We're still not completely back at full employment. And this happens over and over again until eventually we're on a new short-run aggregate supply curve with our level of expectation for inflation correct. And they sell everything that they bring to the market, and we're out of the recession, we're back at full employment. Notice a couple of things about this story. One, it takes a long time. Right? It takes however long it takes for the producers to update their expectations about the level of inflation and change their minds and change their menus and lower their prices until we can get back to full employment. That takes a while. Secondly, You like it when prices fall for the things that you like to buy. But remember what price we don't like to see go down? What's the one price we don't want to see go down? How much you get paid, right? You don't want how much you get paid to go down. You're very resistant to your own wages going down. We call that sticky wages. Sticky wages. We don't like to see our own wages go down. We'd like for everything else to become less expensive and to be still getting just as much money as before. This process of gradually updating our expectations about inflation would require that workers be willing to take a lower wage. But oftentimes they're not so willing. If the economy will self-correct itself, if this process can happen, it's sort of like a pea in a bowl. If you've got a pea in a bowl and for some reason the pea winds up on the side of the bowl like that, what will happen? It'll roll back and forth like a pendulum until it lands back at the bottom again, right? This is equilibrium. The system will bring itself back into equilibrium without any outside intervention. If, however, the economy is more like an upside down bowl, where the pea should be on top of it, what happens if the pea is on the side of it? It's just going to roll off the bowl, isn't it? And so if the pea is going to roll off the bowl, in order to get it back on top, you have to push it there. It requires some sort of outside intervention to make it get there. Now, it could be that the pea will eventually find itself back at the right spot on the bowl, but we want it to get there faster. And so that will justify, or at least be used as a justification, for some sort of intervention into the market to help get us back home again sooner. There are two main ways of intervening in the market process to try to get us back to home faster. One set of tools is called monetary policy, and the other is fiscal policy. Actually, I'm going to do fiscal policy first, but then we'll do monetary. Now, fiscal policy has to do with decisions made by Congress. What Congress can try to do is to either change government spending or change taxes. So, if for some reason we find ourselves in a recession, what is happening here is that for some reason, consumers and investors are not spending as much as they usually do. For some reason, they're not spending as much as they usually do. John Maynard Keynes called that animal spirits, or pessimism generally. Suppose you become a little bit pessimistic. You think, you know what? I don't think I'm going to get paid as much this semester or this year as I got paid last year. I'm going to reduce my spending. And so you don't buy that new car you were planning on buying. Well, when you don't buy that car, the guy who sells cars realizes, I don't think I'm going to make as much money this year as I did last year because I don't think I'm going to sell as many cars. So then the guy you were going to buy the car from spends less money at the grocery store. And when he doesn't buy as much at the grocery store, the grocer realizes, I don't think I'm going to sell as many groceries as I did last year. And that sort of pessimism is contagious throughout the entire economy. So that overall, everybody ends up buying less, and that pushes our aggregate demand curve to the left. People are buying less. Total nominal spending is decreased. Are you with me? So then, if the problem is that consumption and investment have decreased, One way that the government can intervene is by increasing the spending of the government so that total spending is the same. Right? Whatever amount consumers and investors aren't spending, it could be that the government spends enough to make it up. In that case, that would boost aggregate demand back out to its original level. If the government can get it right and can get the exact same amount of more government spending as there was of consumer and investor spending. There's something called the multiplier process that says that the government, if it spends a little, it'll start flowing money through the economy again and boost aggregate demand faster. That's an important element here. It's a selling point of sorts. So that's one approach. The other approach that the government could take is, instead of increasing government spending, it could lower taxes. And if the government reduces taxes, it's like giving more money back to consumers and investors, such that they increase their spending again back to the other levels that they were at before, and that returns aggregate demand back to its original level. Now, there's a problem. How do you get a bill through Congress? Suppose a congressperson has an idea for a law and says, hey, I've got an idea for a law. Let me tell you all about it. And he starts talking to the House of Representatives. He says, okay, my idea is to, and the House says, whoa, 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 hold on, stop. Stop right there. We'll hear about your bill, but first we want you to take it to a committee before you bring it to the entire House. Okay, you take the bill over to the committee. And the committee, you get into the committee and you start to talk to the committee. Okay, here's my idea for the bill. And the committee's like, whoa, 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 wait. Before you tell us all about your idea, why don't you take it to a subcommittee and have them talk about it first? Okay, you go into your subcommittee, you get there with a few other people, you bang out your idea, right? You write a bill, it looks pretty good. Then you bring it back to the committee. You say, okay, here's our idea. The committee says, no, we don't like it. So it goes back to the subcommittee. And you work on it again. You change the law a little bit. You bring it back to the committee. The committee says, no, we still don't like it. Fix it. Okay, so it goes back to the subcommittee, bring it back to the committee. Finally, it passes the committee. The committee says, it's good. Take it to the House. You take it to the House. The rest of the House hears you, and the rest of the House says, no, we don't like it. Put it back to the committee. Right? And the committee says, well, let's put it to the subcommittee, back to the committee, back to the House. And that can happen a few times. Finally, it passes in the House. The bill is finally passed through the House. What happens next? You take it over to the Senate. It goes over to the Senate, and they're like, well, send that to committee. Send that to a subcommittee. Okay, we got it banged out in the committee, send it back to the committee. Okay, got it banged out, nope. Change it here, back to here. Finally, it comes back to the Senate. The Senate says, okay, we like it. And they're like, well, we changed it. So we got to send it back to the House to make sure that they still like it. And then it does the whole dance on the House side again, back to the Senate side again. Finally, both the House and the Senate agree to the bill, and it goes to the president. And the president vetoes it. Says, no, I don't like it. In which case it goes back to Congress, and they have to bang it out again. Finally, they bang it out, they bring it back to the president signs it, and then what happens? The Supreme Court says it's not constitutional. Okay, that's the process for getting a law put into place in the United States. By the way, that's a feature, not a bug, or at least that's how the founders saw it. They were concerned that people with too much power would be able to push their ideas through very easily and very quickly, and so they put these safeguards in place to make it more difficult to pass a law. However, if you're in a recession, and you want to pass some sort of fiscal policy to try to get us out of the recession, while Congress is going back and forth trying to get the law passed, producers are updating their priors about what's happening in the economy. Time is passing on, and it could be that once you pass the law that will boost aggregate demand, you're almost already out of the recession. And if you overboost aggregate demand, that is just like pulling an all-nighter. It could be the thing that causes the next recession. Overboosting the economy can create a bubble. Right? In 2000, 2001, we had what was called the dot-com bubble. Right? The internet was brand new. People had just started laying fiber optic cables under the oceans and across the country, so that using the internet was very, very inexpensive, becoming less expensive. And everybody said, all the investors were like, this is going to make everybody a ton of money, right? And somebody had an idea for an internet company, and the investors were like, shut up and take my money. But then it didn't work. It wasn't as profitable as they thought it was going to be. It's profitable, but it turns out that most things on the internet are free. So there was a bubble, and it popped. In 2007, 2008, there was a housing bubble. It popped, right? We were overinflating, and then it caused a recession. Okay. That's the process of getting fiscal policy put in place, and it has this problem with lags, time lags, for getting a law passed. The alternative approach to making a change when there is a recession that's caused by aggregate demand is to use monetary policy. Monetary policy gets involved directly right here. It increases the quantity supply of money. So that is done through the Federal Reserve, our country's central bank. Our nation's central bank can make decisions about the quantity of money supplied. And it can increase the amount of money in the economy. How does the government increase the quantity of money? You can either print the money, okay, but we don't use cash that much anymore, do we? So how does the government increase the supply of money today? It goes to a bank and says, hey, do you happen to have any treasury bonds that you are holding as an asset? And the bank says, why, yes, I do. I do have some treasury bonds. And the Federal Reserve says, okay, when do those mature? Well, I've got some that are worth $10,000, and they're going to mature next year. So right now, they're really only worth $9,500 to me. The Fed says, we'll give you $9,800 for them. And the bank's like, sure, I'm happy to sell them. And so then the bank gives, the Federal Reserve gives the bank the money. Where did the Federal Reserve get the money to give to the bank? They come from taxes? No, taxes only go through the Treasury. The Federal Reserve got the money by going like this. It just created the money out of thin air. It just says, okay, here, have some money. And it invents the money and gives it to the bank. Now the bank has more money. What does the bank do with that money? What do banks do with money? They loan it out. That's how they make a profit, is by making a loan. So the bank makes a loan, and somebody borrows that money. They take that money that they borrowed, put it in another bank, which means that next bank can also make some more loans, and the supply of money is increased. There's more money flowing through the economy. Are you with me? And the textbook goes into more detail. There's more videos about this. That's basically what's happening. How do we get rid of money? How do we decrease the quantity of money in the economy? Well, the Fed will say to a bank, hey, would you like to buy a bond? The bank's like, okay, what price? And they settle on a price, and then the Federal Reserve gives the bank the bond, the bank gives the Federal Reserve the money, and what does the Federal Reserve do with the money? It throws it in the trash. It's no longer money. Okay. What keeps the Federal Reserve from just printing as much money as it wants to? Well, if it made a lot of money, nobody would want the money. It's the same thing that's happened in other countries, right, where there's been hyperinflation. So the Federal Reserve wants to maintain the value of its money, not just in terms of other things in the United States, but also in terms of other currencies around the world. So the Fed has an incentive to maintain low inflation to protect the value of its money so that other banks will be willing to take it. It used to be that the Federal Reserve was constrained by something called the gold standard, which is to say that every dollar that was in circulation had to be backed by gold in a vault somewhere. Right? We were on that way of doing things, kind of in many ways up until the 1970s. Relatively new that we're not on the gold standard anymore. The Federal Reserve is made up of a bunch of governors and the Federal Reserve chairperson. Currently, the chair of the Federal Reserve is a guy named Jerome Powell. A shift in the aggregate demand curve is not the only thing that can cause a recession. We're used to having 3% growth, but it is possible that something happens in the real world that causes the economy to not be growing as fast as we would want it to be growing. Right? It could be that for some reason there's a war and it destroys half of our capital. And then our total level of productivity will go down for the short run. It could be that that just like in Crusoe on the island, if there's a hurricane and it blows all the fish out of the lagoon and all the coconuts out of the trees, then the actual ability to consume is lessened for a while. That would all be demonstrated by a shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve. The recession that we're in right now is caused in large part by a shift in real ability to produce. It's a shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve. So we would expect to see an increase in inflation that goes along with a shift left of the long-run aggregate supply curve. When there was an oil crisis in the 1970s, that's what we saw. A huge increase in inflation, while a decrease in quality of life. However, through this pandemic, we have also been told to go home and stop producing, but we've also become more frugal. When's the last time you went to a concert? Remember going out to eat? That was mad fun. Right? We've all become a lot more frugal as a result of this pandemic. So then our aggregate demand curve has shifted, as well as our long-run aggregate supply curve having shifted, so we haven't observed a lot of inflation in the economy. Now, Congress has enacted fiscal policy. We got checks for $1,200. The Fed has engaged in a lot of monetary policy. It has bought a whole lot of treasuries and a whole lot of other assets, increasing the quantity supply of money. So the Fed is boosting aggregate demand, Congress is boosting aggregate demand, but that's all because we have so much decreased our consumption that in order to at least maintain this level of aggregate demand, they've had to be involved as well. Our models are not perfect. Macroeconomics has only really been a thing since 1930. It's a relatively new science. We're still developing our understanding of these things. And if you want to understand something, it's good to go and study it a lot, right? So if you want to understand squirrels, you're going to watch a lot of squirrels. Problem is that there aren't that many recessions. There's not that many recessions to go and study to try to understand them that well. And thank God, we don't want recessions. So our understanding is imperfect, and every recession is a little bit different. So it's hard to develop our understanding, and it continues to be imperfect. However, this big framework, this overall way of understanding things, I hope provides you with some tools to think through what's happening around you, and then to be able to be engaged in the democratic conversation more effectively. So when somebody says, maybe we should do this, you're like, well, that might not be such a good idea. Are you with me? That's what I hope to have imparted to you this semester, is a skepticism saying, I'm not sure you can do that. Okay, that's all I have for you. The only other thing that I would say is, a year ago, in March, not even a full year ago, in March, I heard about this pandemic coming through. And I thought, you know what? People are probably going to want to do online classes. So I looked at, on the stock market, the stock price of Zoom, right? It had been around $40 a share, right? When the recession hit, or when the pandemic hit, it took off, right? And it hit close to $500 a share. At the same time, at the same time, people stopped traveling. And when people don't travel, airlines are hurt. So if you looked at the stock for Delta Airlines, it went like this. And it went really low. The federal government actually gave them some stimulus money to help recover. But then this last week, what happened? We got announcements of 2 vaccines. How do you think that these 2 things were affected by the announcement of the vaccines? Now, Zoom didn't go all the way down to $40. It went down to like $300 because we're still going to be using Zoom. But the real world is reflecting some of the things that we've talked about in this class. It is relevant. Okay, thank you. Go check it for yourself. It's been nice talking to you. Nice knowing you. Bless you all. See you.